All right, moving right along here. Despite the widespread poverty, discrimination, and pressure created by this unbalanced sex ratio, remember 25 males to every one female, Chinatowns appeared and grew in New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and many other cities. San Francisco, of course. Chinese Americans responded to their exclusion by finding economic opportunity in areas where dominant group competition was weak, i.e., laundry facilities, restaurants, um, and they remained what we still think of them as a relatively hidden from general view group. And within these Chinatowns, which allowed them to be somewhat hidden, these ethnic enclaves, Chinatown became the world in which the second generation of Chinese Americans grew to adulthood, which continued to emphasize the importance of their culture. The second generation tended to look beyond the enclave. Of course, we see this with all second generations. They founded their own organizations that were more compatible with American lifestyles. World War II brought more economic opportunities, jobs, military service, GI Bill, socioeconomic mobility. And the women of the second generation also pursued education, and as early as 1960, the median years of schooling were slightly higher for women than for Chinese American men. Although well educated, Chinese Americans could find good jobs in the mainstream economy. The highest, most lucrative positions, and those that required direct supervision of whites, were still closed to them. So even though they were well educated, and even though they were gaining some access with some social mobility, the top jobs were still held for white people. Many Chinese Americans who stayed in the Chinatowns and the immigrants who began arriving after 1965, they began to rely for survival on low-wage jobs in the garment industry, the service sector, and the small businesses of the enclave economy. Therefore, Chinese Americans are often said to be bipolar in their occupational structure, meaning a lot in the low end, a lot in the high end. The context situation for Japanese immigrants resembled that of Chinese in reference to the anti-Japanese campaign. Although Japanese immigration was partly curtailed in 1907 when a gentleman's agreement was signed, but there was a loophole that allowed women to continue to immigrate until the 1920s. Japanese Americans were thus able to develop a second generation in the United States without much delay that numbered about half of the group by 1930 and represented a majority of 63% on the eve of World War II. You can imagine World War II is going to create some significant issues for immigrants of Japanese descent in the United States. In 1910, between 30 and 40% of all Japanese in California were engaged in agriculture. They owned small plots of land, and they comprised a really small percentage of West Coast farmers. Their presence and relative success stimulated discriminatory legislation in the Alien Land Act, which declared aliens who were ineligible for citizenship to also be ineligible to own land. Once again, we see citizenship and the importance, therefore, of having citizenship rear its ugly head. Japanese Americans were able to dodge the discriminatory legislation, mostly by putting titles on land in the names of their American-born children, who, of course, were citizens by law. I also want you to remind you that in the last section we talked about Cesar Chavez, the struggle in the fields, the creation of the United Farm Workers Union. Well, if you remember correctly, it was Asian Americans that had initially went on strike in the fields that the Mexican immigrants took advantage of and followed suit. So there is a connection between Asian Americans in the farm community in the West Coast and Mexican American struggles in the fields as well. By World War II, the first generation, which is known as the Issei, had come to dominate a narrow but important segment of the agriculture on the West Coast. Other first generation folks in urban areas were concentrated in a narrow range of businesses and services, such as domestic service and gardening. Japanese Americans maximized their economic clout by doing businesses with other Japanese-owned firms as often as possible. This is extremely important if you're trying to build up capital. You reach out to businesses that are much more likely to see things your way, and you create business relationships with them, and then you protect your interests on both sides. In the years before World War II, the Japanese American community was largely dependent for survival on their network of cooperation and mutual assistance, and we're not really focusing much on Americanization and integration. Of course, this makes them unable to find acceptance in Anglo society, whereas the Nisei, the second generation, established organizations that reflected their high levels of Americanization. An example of this is the Japanese American Citizens League. Although the Nisei enjoyed high levels of success in school, the intense discrimination and racism in the 1930s prevented most of them from translating their educational achievements into better jobs and higher salaries. Many Nisei were forced to remain within the enclave, and in many cases, their demoralization and anger over the exclusion were eventually swamped by larger events of World War II. 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which led to the relocation of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. By the late summer of 1942, more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, young and old, men and women, virtually the entire West Coast population had been forcibly transported to relocation camps where they were imprisoned behind barbed wire fences, patrolled by armed guards daily, and suffered humiliation and abuses within the camps. The majority of these people were American citizens, and no one was given the opportunity to refute the implicit charge of disloyalty. The government gave families little notice to prepare for the evacuation and secure their homes, businesses, and belongings. Eventually, more than 25,000 escaped the camps by volunteering for military service, many with distinction. The camps did reduce the extent to which women were relegated to a subordinate role, but some Japanese Americans brought lawsuits to end the program, and in 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that detention was unconstitutional. In 1948, Congress passed legislation to authorize compensation to Japanese Americans, but these claims were eventually settled for less than 1/10 of the amount of the actual economic losses these people went through because of this internment in concentration camps. Demand for meaningful redress and compensation continued, and in 1988, Congress passed a bill granting reparations of about $20,000 in cash to each of the 60,000 remaining survivors of the camps. The law also acknowledged that the relocation program had been a grave injustice to Japanese Americans. A side note here, the governor of the state of California during the internment process was Governor Earl Warren. He ended up serving on the Supreme Court. He made a deal with Eisenhower if he could deliver California to, or if he was helpful in delivering California to Eisenhower in the 1950 election, that Eisenhower would appoint him to the Supreme Court with the next available position. And Eisenhower wins. Warren gets appointed to the next available position, which is actually the Chief Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. He becomes the Chief Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was filed and the Supreme Court took up that piece of legislation, or that legal challenge, should I say, Judge Earl Warren was the Chief Justice. And Judge Earl Warren, feeling very, very bad about what he had done, what he had ordered in the state of California in the internment of Japanese Americans, made it his personal responsibility, his moral responsibility, to deliver a court ruling that overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. And he felt so strongly about this that he made sure there was no dissenting views on Brown versus Board of Education. So it's interesting how all of these things end up working within other groups. So the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II actually becomes a determining factor in the decision, the landmark decision by the Supreme Court in 1954 for Brown versus Board of Education. Yeah. For the Nisei, when the war ended, they were unwilling to rebuild the Japanese community as it had been before. When anti-Asian prejudice declined in the 50s and the job market began to open up, the Nisei were educationally prepared to take advantage, and they thrived. By 1960, Japanese Americans had an occupational profile very similar to that of whites, except that they were actually overrepresented among professionals. And there was a tendency to choose safe careers that did not require extensive contact with the public or supervision of whites. An additional factor contributed to the perception of the model minority that Japanese Americans especially have been labeled with is the small number of immigrants from Japan that the community has not had to devote resources to. Furthermore, recent immigrants from Japan tend to be highly educated professionals, people whose socioeconomic characteristics add to the perception of success and influence. In any case, the Sansei and the Yonshi are highly integrated into the occupational structure of the larger society. So, Japanese Americans have, based on a unique set of circumstances, been able to position themselves in pretty high-paying jobs in the American economy. Two of the most important characteristics of the minority group are the objects of a pattern of disadvantage, and are they easily identified either culturally or physically. These two traits, of course, work in tandem, and members of the dominant group must be able to determine a person's group membership quickly and easily so the discrimination that is the hallmark of the minority group can be practiced. The Burokun of Japan have been victimized by discrimination and prejudice for hundreds of years, but are virtually indistinguishable from the general population. Therefore, the identity of the traditional Burakumin areas of residence are well known, and this information, not race or culture, is what establishes the boundaries of the groups and forms the ultimate barrier to Burakumian assimilation into the Japanese economies.